Thanks everyone for making it out on a Monday night after Easter. I hope everyone's had a great Easter and hopefully a bit of time off. So thank you to our speakers tonight, and we'll jump into it. So the Victorian National Parks Association, along with the Save Western Port Woodlands group, welcomes everyone tonight. Thank you for coming. On December 19th, a small fire was started near one of the sand quarries next to the Gerties Nature Conservation Reserve. That fire then turned into a large bushfire. The fire swept through the Gerties Nature Conservation Reserve on December 19th and 20th, threatening properties in the Gerties and further afield. I had family members there fighting that fire. So thank you to all the brave firefighters who helped put out that shocking fire. Around 192 hectares was burnt in total, including 125 in the northern section of the Gerties Reserve. Most of the 50 hectares of the Council Native Veg Offset Reserve was also burnt, with a small area of the nearby Hurdy-Gurdy Nature Conservation Reserve also burnt. A month after the fire, the VMPA and the Save Western Port Woodlands group began camera trapping to assess the impact of the fire on local plants and animals. As the community and ecosystem recovers from the bushfire, Save Western Port Woodlands and the VMPA thought it would be good to bring together experts on bushfire management to discuss the fire management and future fire regimes in the Western Port Woodlands and how we can all work together to help the community and ecosystem recover following the bushfire. So we've got two, one's a local legend and one's a fire management legend. We have Professor Michael Clarke, who's Emeritus Professor of Zoology at Trobe University. He leads research along with his colleague, Professor Andrew Bennett, in the impact of fire in the Mallee, Box-Ironbark forests, and Central Highlands and Wilson's Prom. And I see a few of the attendees know those areas quite well. I see some people from the Box-Ironbark country and a few from the down near the Prom. So that's good to have you here. In 2010, Mike was appeared as an expert witness in fire ecology at the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission. He recently completed a 3-year term as a member of the Board of Directors of Parks Victoria. He is actively involved in making sure conservation policy is based on the best available evidence. And our other speaker, which many of the Bass Coast locals might know, is the former Mayor of Bass Coast Shire Council, a champion for climate action locally and regionally, Mr. Michael Whelan, who has CFA experience both on ground and as a senior advisor to the former Victorian Emergency Services Minister. So thank you both very much for being with us tonight. And I will now hand over to Professor Mike Clarke, who's going to do a short presentation, and then we'll jump into the conversation after that. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Jordan. I'm hoping everyone can see my slides. If you can give me a thumbs up that something's showing, that's really great. I want to begin exploring the challenges of managing fire for people. And at the start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm working, and we're talking about this afternoon, the Bunurong and Boonwurrung clan, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all who are working so hard to conserve patches of bushland like the Gerties and the Western Port Woodlands. The CFA, the Save the Western Port Woodlands, Forest Fire Management Victoria and Parks Vic, all doing different tasks in trying to conserve a very precious place. I want to also begin by acknowledging that the topic we're going to be discussing is still going to be pretty raw for some people. It's been a traumatic summer. And I it's been pretty disturbing for lots of people, and what we're going to be exploring may be a bit triggering for some. So just go in with that mindset and be careful in how we talk about and explore this really challenging topic together. And it is challenging. It's not rocket science, as a legend in fire ecology said. It's much more complex than that. And I'm going to try and unpack some of that. Most Victorians recognise that we live in a highly flammable landscape, and that was really brought out, as Jordan said, with this Gertie's fire that started in December last year, on December 19th, and came right close to some housing estates adjacent to the reserve. Many of us are aware that fire has been a part of the Australian landscape for a very long time, and that Indigenous people have and continue to use fire to manage that landscape. But prior to the colonisation of Australia by humans, fire's been a part of this landscape for millions of years. And we know the general narrative that because of that, it bounces back in some cases pretty quickly. This is a picture of the Gertie's Reserve taken on Friday, and you can see some of the resprouting that's already taken place in that part of the world. Here's a peppermint that's resprouting from epicormic buds beneath the bark, doing what comes naturally, and there's signs of acacia seeds that have been triggered to germinate by the heat or smoke produced by the fire. Those sort of recovery events are dramatic, and they're striking. This is a little sequence I'll whip through quickly from my work down at the Prom after the 2005 fire. And here we are just 9 months after the fire, 4 years after the fire, 6 years after the fire, and superficially you'd say, oh, well, everything's back to normal again. And so we have this strange relationship with fire in Australia, where sometimes we view it through the lens of all fire is bad and must be stopped immediately, to don't you worry about this, it's all fine. Fire is a natural part of the Australian landscape, and she'll be right if you're just a bit patient, and it'll bounce back. And so we oscillate between worrying whether we're looking at an ecological disaster or something that we could call a natural regeneration event. And so I want to set this fire in some context and introduce some concepts to you that I think are really important. If we're thinking about a fire like the Gertie's, I think it's really important that we don't view the fire, a single fire in isolation, but rather as part of what that landscape has experienced over time and space. And so I'm going to introduce the idea of fire regimes and 5 components of fire that we need to be mindful when we're trying to make an assessment what's been the impact of the latest fire. And that first question you ask is, what's been the gap between this fire and the previous fire in this landscape? That's the frequency. How often are fires happening in this landscape? Secondly, what time of year did this fire occur? Was it in the height of summer? Was it in the spring breeding season, flowering season? Was it in autumn? Related to that is how hot, this sounds a bit ridiculous question for fire, but how hot was the fire? How many layers of the vegetation were harmed during this fire? Did it just consume the ground layer, or did it scorch the canopy, or did it actually consume the canopy as well? And that's the term severity. And as a zoologist, I'm really interested in extent. How extensive, how much of a block of the bushland was burnt when this fire took place? Was it all consuming, or were there unburnt sections? As we can see in the Gertie's fire, a good proportion of the reserve was left unburnt. The final component that's really critical in thinking about the impact of a fire was the way in which it burnt over the landscape. Was it a uniform fire that burnt all layers all through the forest? Or were there unburnt patches? Were there some parts where the canopy was left green and still intact? And that patchiness, whether there's refuges, unburnt refuges or islands within the fire, is crucially important for wildlife and its recolonisation. So when I look at a fire, I try to get my head around what's the fire regimes the wildlife and plants in that location have evolved to cope with. Are they used to fires this frequent at this time of year, this severe, and this extensive, and this uniform or patchy? And I want to stress tonight that places like the Western Port Woodlands are diverse in their vegetation types. and one size of or type of fire doesn't suit all. The coastal grasslands will tolerate very frequent fires in every under 5 years frequency. Other woodlands, like the Coast Banksias, will be deeply offended and some will die by a fire. And others, like dam forest, much prefer big gaps between fires. So I just want to stress it's dangerous to generalise across vegetation types. I want to contrast the way in which plants recover from fire from animals. Plants have a whole suite of nifty adaptations to regenerate on site. And so we can think about a plant like a Banksia spinulosa. The adult might get killed by a fire, but because of its woody seed cones, it'll let the seed go. But the critical issue is whether the next fire happens before or after this seedling that's growing, germinated after the fire, whether it's had time to set seed or not. And then there's another suite of plants who actually need fire to trigger germination, like this running postman. And its seed can happily sit in the soil seed bank for decades. Eventually it will succumb to fungi or other predators eating it. But if it doesn't get a fire, it could disappear for a different reason, for an absence, too infrequent fire. So in between here is a sweet spot between not too much and not too little fire. Animals will be relying on things not just whether the plant flowers or not, what time it takes to set seed, but whether the resources it needs, things like hollows for breeding, deep litter layers or food sources, how long they'll take to appear in the landscape and where they'll be. So animals don't have the capacity typically to regenerate on site within a fire. They're going to be either incinerated, asphyxiated or exhausted by a fire. They'll need, if they're lucky and they get through the fire, they're going to need to find food, like this swamp wallaby trying to hoover up acacia seedlings after the fire. If they have the ability to fly or move out of the way of the fire, they are then going to be waiting to emigrate from unburnt bits back into the landscape to recolonise. And I think I want to stress this difference between plants and animals. So the plants have got all these on-site attributes that enable them to regenerate on-site. But if we put ourselves in the shoes of a southern brown bandicoot, and I'm hoping there might be some in the Gerties, and yet to be confirmed, I think, but if there were, then they may well be able to recolonise the burnt bit once it recovers. That's what we hope. But if we imagine in the future that the Granville Reserve got all burnt, there's a bigger question mark in our heads whether any dispersing southern brown bandicoot without a corridor connecting it is going to make it to that reserve. And so this may become bandicoot extinct, an exclusion zone for bandicoots, just because they don't have this dispersal capacity or the habitat or corridors along which to safely disperse. So quite a different situation between plants and animals. When we think about adding or keeping fire out of landscape, there are two broad rationales for adding fire. One is to reduce the hazard, protecting the things that matter to us, human life and property, the assets, water, timber, homes, farms, schools, kindergartens, fodder for our stock. The other common reason we might set fire to a landscape is to foster the ecological health and resilience of that landscape. And I've been involved in that down at Wilson's Promontory for a number of years. And here we were burning grassland to try and control invasion by coast tea tree. So we need to be really clear, if we're going to put fire into a landscape, are we actually achieving the reasons that we say we are? Are we making people safer? Are we actually protecting the assets? And if we're doing it for ecological reasons, is the ecosystem actually benefiting or being harmed from what we're doing? And these are not straightforward questions to answer. A lot of people have been starting to look at some of the places in which hazard reduction burning has been undertaken and are beginning to try and unpick how long the hazard reduction is effective for. So this is a slide taken in the Tallarook Forest by Carl Just. And after just 6 years, the understory is very, very thick in the areas that were burnt. I went for a wander around the Gerties on Friday, and I was curious there to see parts of the Gerties that had been burnt in planned burns, and there was very dense acacia growth on the sites that had been burnt, and just on the opposite side of the track, much less vegetation underneath it. So that raises questions for me. Did it actually achieve what we hoped it would achieve if we thought we were reducing fuel loads? And how long was the fuel reduced? There's no question that immediately after the fire, the fuel loads will be reduced. And a significant effect would be achieved. But unless we're monitoring these things, we won't know how long those effects might be fruitful. We also need to be aware that there can at times be unexpected or unintended ecological consequences for some management actions we might take. In our group, we've been studying cool burns in the Box-Ironbark woodlands, and this is a very, very cool burn just trickling along through the leaf layer. One of our students, Dr. Anna Flanagan-Moody, has been looking at this beautiful little animal, the yellow-footed antechinus, and where they go in their den logs to both hide during the day and also to breed. And she monitored the impact of some cool burns on the den logs of these yellow-footed antechinus and brush-tailed phascogale in the Box-Ironbark. And her study showed that just with a simple cool burn trickling through the understory, there was a loss of 50% of logs in the area, and of the large den logs, 75%. So this is the same site before and after the understory has just been allowed to trickle through, a fire has gone through that understory. So these are really challenging situations. So it's really crucial for us to be clear when we set fire or put a fire out, what do we hope that's achieving? And implicit in that is that we need to be monitoring the consequences, not assuming that it's always doing what we hope it's doing. I want to finish up with a very brief comment on climate change. There's a model being put forward of how we understand bushfire spread being likened to 4 switches, and if they're all turned up, we've got a really bad, troublesome day. And climate change modelers have been thinking about what's the likely projection in the future of the effect of climate change on these 4 switches. Fires will spread depending on the quantity of available material in the plant material that's available. What's going to happen to that is really unclear under climate change. With reduced rainfall, we may have in some places more vegetation, some places less. What's not uncertain, what's pretty obvious, is that much of it is going to be drier more often under most climate change scenarios. The condition of available plant material that's available for burning will be increasing. There's uncertainty about whether lightning strikes are going to go up or down, but certainly as humans move more into the landscape, there'll be more opportunities for ignitions. What's unambiguous is that the number of bad fire days with low humidity, high temperature, high wind strength is expected to increase. That's what the future looks like for much of southeastern Australia. Some very brief conclusions. We need to be moving into the best fire management we can. I'm going to argue that's based on place-based, local, detailed knowledge, which people on this webinar are possessors of. You know your patch really well. And some of you are engaged in ongoing monitoring, which is terrific. We need to engage where we can with local fire planners and share that knowledge. And we need to be planning for a fiery future, I'm afraid. That's conserving what's left, connecting patches with wildlife corridors, avoiding inappropriate location of housing developments, and appreciating this is a shared responsibility. It's not one of those situations where they ought to do something about this. They is us. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Jordan.
Great. Thank you, Professor Clarke. That was awesome. So I'm going to hand over to Michael Whelan now, and both Professor Clarke and Michael Whelan are going to jump into a chat. If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat below, and we will have time for questions at the end. So thank you to both of our speakers for being open to Q&A. So yeah, that's awesome. So I'll hand over to Michael Whelan, and off we go.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Professor Clarke. Very informative. And before launching into what I have to say, I'd like to also acknowledge that we're on Bunurong and Boonwurrung country. Pay my respects to the elders present and emerging. I want to take an aspect of what Michael's said and develop it from my experience, which is more on the fire management side of things. And firstly, I accept the evidence that indicates we're in an existential climate and species extinction crisis. The evidence also suggests we are not doing anything near enough to address the crisis. I also accept that there is an intrinsic value to the natural environment and its flora and fauna that should be given agency in a land management decision. I look at the woodlands as much through a climate lens as through a natural environment lens. It is a carbon sink as well as a species sink. It plays a key role in preserving the water quality of Western Port as well. I congratulate, say, the Woodlands Group for, against the odds, I might say, flipping the anti-ecological normal commercial approach of government and business, at least so far. I recommend Tim Hollow's book, Living Democracy, for a greater discussion of the term anti-ecological business, because it is a thing, it's what we live with, and it's not good enough. We accelerate the extinction crisis if we continue the way we're going. The woodlands burnt recently, and it elicited the usual sensational approach in our local media, attempts at finger pointing and an emotional response. To your credit, many of you have sought a better understanding of the role and impact of fire, and there are opportunities, I think, from that management perspective that present themselves to the woodlands people. Bushfire as a part of nature is a restorative and destructive force. In contrast to climate change or extinction, bushfires occur over minutes, hours and days and elicit a rapid response. And in their wake, ill-considered reprobation, an example being the Black Saturday Adversarial Royal Commission, from which we lost a chief officer in Victoria, and I might say one of the best senior fire officers in the country. Climate change, on the other hand, is a slow-ticking carbon bomb that escalates over decades and allows places for politicians and others to hide and obfuscate. In my time in the CFA, and I think still today, fire was regarded as a bad, to be avoided, and when it occurred, to be extinguished. The CFA lectured to people about a properly prepared house. We maintained a myth that we could indeed control fire and protect communities and homes in the path of bushfire. People impacted by fire were victims, but not our responsibility. Social services were the ones that came in after the fire to deal with that. The myth is exposed with events like Ash Wednesday, Black Saturday, or the Black Summer bushfires, and I probably expose my aging referring to all three of those. During a fire, people living in the bush may have the benefit of a truck and crew at their place, or may be disappointed and on their own. If you watched the ABC show recently on the fires around Malibu, a key complaint was the absence of a fire truck. People's concept was of a house fire, not a running wildfire. Many people living in or near the bush do not get it. About 25 years ago, and I think this is an important point from the ongoing management perspective, my team at the CFA developed a program called Community Fireguard that recognised the capability and the decisions made by people who choose to live in bushfire areas. It recognised their intelligence. It sought to impart knowledge of fire and enable better decision making by people impacted by bushfire, in preparation of that and also at the time of fires occurring. As far as I know, it still runs today because I went to its 20th anniversary about 5 years ago, but it didn't achieve mainstream practice with CFA. The Black Summer Royal Commission made many recommendations, and some have been very destructive of vegetation, particularly in built-up areas, the 1030 rule, for example. The Commission scolded the stay and protect approach in favour of evacuation. The publicity you see today from Victorian agencies and the government deliberately misleads people into blindly deciding to evacuate in the face of fire. They would argue that point, but really when you scare people, you are eliciting that flight response. The likelihood is when unable to do so, people will react poorly. It is not always safe to evacuate. I know people that live in the Dandenongs, one way in, one way out. They need a plan B if that fire is already blocking that road as it occurs, and that can happen in minutes in some situations. If you look at the Ash Wednesday fires, that certainly occurred. Nature and the environment provide context for many land management decisions, but are often the casualty to decisions that assert progress. In the woodlands context, we can see that in the battle to prevent their destruction from sand mining, we also see that the trade-offs in favour of human safety in the bushfire context. Currently in Bass Coast, we see in the context of coastal erosion, where hard protection measures are put in place to protect human assets, rather than ecological solutions that involve a relocation of human assets. It's getting more publicity at the moment, but it is the same in bushfire management. The bushland will be at risk in the interface areas. By interface areas, I mean those areas where we introduce people into the bushland context, and we already have that in parts of the bushlands. Sensationalism and emotional outcry will always trump science and long-term good sense. Increasing the interface through urban encroachment will be a constant and increasing threat to the woodlands. There's my other challenge of the two I posed tonight, is how do we prevent that happening? I finish with a question, and that was around, going back, showing my age again, I recall meeting Dr. Tom Beer back in the mid-1980s when he was researching bushfire impacts ahead of his paper, Australian Bushfire Danger Under Changing Climatic Regimes. And he did a forecast of what fire danger would be like now, but from about the change of the century. The paper became the first study in the world to ask what climate change was going to mean for wildfires beyond 2000. As Beer laments today, science was not listened to then. We have firefighters such as Greg Mullins speaking loudly about climate impact on bushfire behaviour and the limited and closing windows for management measures such as fuel reduction burning. That was almost a Freudian slip there, wasn't it, fuel reduction burning? What are the implications for fire danger in the Western Port Woodlands? Is there a way back to a regime of less fire danger? I'll leave those points hanging. Thanks, Jordan.
Great. Thank you, Michael, very much. We'll jump into some of the questions. The first one is for Professor Mike. You were in the Gerties on Friday. What has that fire shown you or taught you after visiting that landscape?
I was really struck, Jordan, by the courage of anyone who was defending homes in that circumstance, just walking around parts of the interface between the bushland and the expectations we have of CFA or other volunteers or agency staff under those circumstances. It was just really chilling looking at that. Ecologically, I was struck by the severity of the fire. It was with the bits that I could get into, and not all of it was accessible. Looked like a pretty hot fire, high severity, scorched a lot of canopy, if not consumed it. So it's a severe fire that's going to ecologically take a while to bounce back, but the vegetation types that I was able to look at, the stringy bark forests and the peppermints, are a lowland forest, and they're pretty darn resilient. I was relieved to see there was a good chunk of unburnt part of the reserve there, because that's going to be absolutely crucial. And that, to me, is the Achilles heel of every small reserve we have, is does the whole island go under in one fire? Because with a fragmented landscape, with lacking in corridors, recolonisation, particularly of reptiles, mammals, those things that are slower to move across the landscape, is going to be so dependent on connectivity. And so when a reserve as small as this, the whole reserve doesn't go up in one hit, we can be really thankful for that. That's a big bonus.
Awesome. Michael Whelan, do you have anything to add from seeing the Gerties after the fire?
Well, unfortunately, I've not been through the fire. I was otherwise occupied on Friday. I won't go into any details on what I was doing, but I was still a bit groggy from the anaesthetic. That'll give a clue. So what I would say is that we need to put in place management arrangements, ensure management arrangements are put in place that are sensitive to fire. And that's Michael's already said that, so I'm only reiterating, but that those management regimes really take into account and don't make matters worse. So that'll be my take on that.
Yeah, awesome. So our next set of questions are about planning and small reserve management. So with Victoria's growing population, how can we plan to avoid future risks to communities from bushfires like that we had in the Gerties? Who would like to go first? Professor Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to challenge the question and the expectation within it a bit, Jordan. I don't think we can avoid the risks. I think we need to be a public that are recognise we're never going to be able to avoid and make everybody safe. And if we're creating the impression that we're going to be able to do that, then we're living in a fool's paradise. So what can we do to reduce the risk? The number one for me is planning to avoid inappropriate local developments, avoid placing large numbers of people and dwellings right beside bushland that's burned, is the number one. And Michael's touched on the one road in, one road out. It's just diabolical. If we're setting up developments in that sort of framework, that's my top one is and taking a collective responsibility if there have been really dopey planning decisions in the past, collectively as a community, owning that for the people who have left in those very vulnerable locations. That's a collective decision. Our various levels of government have allowed to happen. The people have gone to live in those places because they're really attractive. We could wipe our hands and say, well, bad luck, that's your choice. But I think collectively we're not terribly good, as Michael's indicated, at planning ahead. And I think we've got to look at some exit strategies.
Absolutely. I was on a bushwalk in the Dandenong Ranges National Park on the weekend, and there's a few blocks that are pretty much in the middle of the park in sections. And I was very disappointed to see one of them with a house on it now. It was up for sale 2 years ago and there's a house. And I thought after the 2009 fires that we all said we weren't going to put people in harm's way. We were going to take them out of harm's way and put areas like that, restore them and add them back to the park. Michael Whelan, as a former councillor, how have you been able to see that type of forward planning happen at a local government level in terms of trying to plan developments away from the bushland? But as we've seen with the Gerties fire, the fire did jump and spread through cleared paddocks and the like as well. So did you see any forward type planning when you're in council?
Jordan, the answer to that is yes and no. So there was some very good work done ahead of my time in council, which wasn't relating to bushfires, but it carries the example, which was around land subject to inundation. And in actual fact, Bass Coast led that back in the about 2014, 2016 period. And it was really good work, and they had to actually fight the state to actually get the level of coverage they got. But then proceeded, in my mind, to still allow development in those areas. And it was only during the latter part of my time in council that it was actually the water board that started enforcing it, and it caused incredible outrage. And that's the problem I got. To go to Michael's point earlier, that if we think we can manage some of these, let people in there and manage it, we're in a fool's paradise. We already are across the board in emergency and disaster situations. What we need the first principle of planning in this should be to avoid. Those areas we don't have development, we should not allow development. And I can't see local government coming up with that bright idea. It's going to need to be from community demand. And that's why I think something like the Community Fireguard program that I talked about earlier would be a valuable vehicle for this, because it's one thing to say, as Michael said, that you can say, okay, you built in there, you're on your own, but we don't. And we know we won't, because once those voices are raised, it becomes powerful politically. And we're seeing that with the inundation and the coastal erosion stuff. So we need to avoid it. Those that are already in there, we need to educate. Now, we keep saying that, but there's a way that was developed, as I say, 25 years ago that went into that. It basically says, this is where you live. This is the sorts of decisions you're going to be confronted with at some point in the future. You need to plan. And what's more, we're here to help you with that. So it's not going in. We used to go in and tell you, I got to have properly this and that. And, you know, there's one good thing that come out of the Bushfire Royal Commission, and I say that with the intent of what it meant, one good thing, because a lot of bad, and there always is out of Royal Commissions because they're adversarial. The one good thing that came out of it was the building requirements. It upped the standard of buildings required for bushfire-prone areas. Now, it's also increased the cost of building in those areas. You would have seen post-Malibu, and it was you expect the idiocy from people like Trump, I guess, but of wanting people to be able to build quickly, starting to blame the authorities. What we need to know, don't do that, because that's what we used to do through my career in the CFA. Just the emphasis is on getting people resettled back there, and absolutely the wrong thing to do. If they're going to go back, then it goes back better. It has to go back better with a chance of survival. But the important thing is that we really educate people so they make good, sound decisions in the face of a fire. And that's what we don't do. As I criticised earlier, the advertising that you see from the Victorian government just scares people. So they're going to make bad decisions. They're going to make panicky decisions. I heard some horror stories out of Black Saturday. I lived a few of them because I was in that fire. But horror stories of people evacuating through fire and all the rest. They should not be here. Thank God they are, or whoever, that they're here. But it's really, people, you know, it shouldn't be like that. If you live in the bush, you should have an obligation to inform yourself, but we have to then facilitate that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Jordan, just before we move on, can I just perhaps share a slide so people are familiar with the consequences of when we build beside one of these reserves? I'll just share for a second the planning scheme, and that one that's I want to share. I'm hoping you're looking at a slide with yellow and
Yep.
Yeah, just this is the little dots here are human dwellings, and this is a council reserve around it. Fire management has an obligation once there's a dwelling and an asset nearby, and they zone bits of our reserves differently depending on its proximity to those human assets. So once we build something like this becomes an asset protection zone, and firefight managers are entitled to do more actions more often, like planned burning, if it's up against. If we come back from that, we have the next zone is bushfire moderation zone or bushfire management zone. And typically planned burns in a BMZ can be 8 to 15 years apart. Once you're into the landscape management zone, fire intervals then can just simply be on an ecological basis. But I just want to follow up from Michael and just highlight, if we start dotting more and more developments around these places, the obligation shifts back to the agency. Okay, you've now got to manage your side of the fence differently because somebody has developed, and that goes down to the classification and zoning around these areas, and that then becomes risk reduction led as opposed to ecologically necessarily the best thing you need to do ecologically. Two different things. So we may not have set foot in the park, but our very presence next door to it will alter how the parks how the park's managed or the reserves managed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that conflict a lot here at the VMPA, ecologically questionable fires and removal of timber and the like. And that you look through the lens of the fire managers, and yeah, it's quite the tightrope they have to manage. So there's definitely a like you said at the start, or the fire legend, it's not rocket science. It's a lot worse than that.
And can I add to that, Jordan? What you see is, and we saw it only in the last couple of weeks, can't quite drag the detail back, but where a fuel reduction burn got away and had become a wildfire, and the criticism of the fire managers. Yet if if that fire occurs in a situation when they haven't been fuel reduction burning, it's a criticism of the fire managers.
Yeah.
We don't have that concept in the community. And as Greg Mullins points out very eloquently, that was supposed to be, that window for safe burning is becoming, well, it's almost not there. We're in a drought now. I haven't called it that, but I'm convinced down here we're in a drought at the moment. And this becomes sort of our normal, I think.
Absolutely. So our next sort of questions about the recovery of the Western Port Woodlands ecosystem and future appropriate fire regimes. So with such a large area of the Gerties Nature Conservation Reserve burnt, what do future fire management regimes look like, and how can we help local ecosystems and wildlife recover from that fire, while also thinking about the future fires that are going to happen? So I'll hand over to Professor Mike.
The most immediate thing that's really helpful is to nail every feral predator you can in the district. They are attracted, the research shows they are really good at sussing out where burnt areas and move into them. Feral cats and foxes will move into the burnt areas and hammer the wildlife that happened to be lucky enough to get through the fire and now has nowhere to hide, no vegetation to hide behind. So not the most obvious thing to do, but it's an opportunity to really go hard on all your ferals, as your deer as well. So that's at the top of my list. I guess the other thing is to take a landscape scale approach, not just view the Gerties in isolation, but think what this does to the distribution of different vegetation type and age classes across the whole landscape. And that's a scale at which we should be thinking of management, not just individual reserve by reserve. The fact that we've got a couple of different age classes now in the Gerties Reserve is probably not a bad thing ecologically. But we need to be careful and think, as I said before, in a nuanced way about different veg types. Some will benefit from this fire and some will be damaged by it. And I get really nervous when anyone says to me, it's really obvious what you should do here. I think it requires great place-based knowledge, intimate knowledge. I've just been enjoying reading Dick Wetenhall's book. It's that kind of detailed familiarity with the landscape that should be informing what we do in these places, and trying things, being ready to make mistakes and acknowledge you've made a mistake. And you'll only do that if you're monitoring the consequences of your actions. That's the bit that I can't stress too highly, and I think VNPA and its affiliates are in such a strong position to be the eyes and ears, to move us past just desktop management of landscapes and saying, well, this is what the GIS layer says it should be. It should be ready for another burn now. Your organisation has people in the parks who can say, well, actually, under climate change, this hasn't recovered as fast as everyone assumed it would have. It's been a drought couple of years. Burning it now could result in a local extinction. And I don't think you know that unless you know your patch really well and you get out in the park on a regular basis and can make those observations. If I was lucky enough to plan really long term, I'd say the best way to react to fires like these of small reserves is to move on with your corridor planting. We need to be joining up the reserves, because these little isolates are fabulous, but they're just going to be continually going downhill if they remain isolates forever. So hang on to everything you've got and join them up.
Have you got anything to add, Michael Whelan?
I'll add one thing, because I absolutely defer to Professor Clarke on the ecology side of things. But one thing is that we need to get inside those management plans and influence those, and that's it's even at the planning level for local government. And it is timely in the sense that each new council reviews the planning scheme. That's usually a bit of the staff review and put in what they want to see changed. But let's, as a community, take the opportunity to try and influence that so we get some sensible reform. And so it's advocacy, but let's make sure we also advocate into the community. And I know a lot of them are here tonight, which is wonderful, is that we advocate into the community with information as well. That both ways advocacy is so important, taking the expertise and distributing it.
Jordan, if I can indulge me at this point, just
Go for it.
Follow up on Michael's point and show you an opportunity that exists. If I go to my next slide here, which I'm hoping people see, a mechanical fuel treatment. Yeah, this is, anyone can go onto the DECA. If you type into the website Joint Fuel Management Program, this is the place DECA describes the justification and the location of the planned burn its NPV is planning to do in the coming 3 years. And so you can sort of see in this slide for the Gerties, the current plan has for a fuel reduction burn scheduled for this coming year, for this coming fuel reduction season in the Gerties. Now, we need to understand why they're doing that as a community. That's develop fuel-reduced areas of sufficient width and communities, reduce the spread and intensity of bushfires. And they welcome comment. We need to do it, though, in light of the changed circumstances since that plan was developed. A big chunk of the reserve and neighbouring country has burnt. And it's pretty obvious that you would go back to square one and say, is this the best place to add fire here? Do we need to add fire to this reserve right now? And what I'd be encouraging all the membership to do is look at your local patch and look up every year, look up the Joint Fuel Management Program and see if it makes ecological and risk reduction sense to you. And FMV, Forest Fire Management Victoria, are looking for feedback on these plans, so we better give it to them. We should be with evidence-based, and you need to appreciate the timing of these plans. So they are typically under development right now at this time of the year, middle of the year, and they tend to solidify and get signed off by the Chief Fire Officer around September, October. So it's really too late after the event to say, oh, we actually don't like the idea of that. Now is the very opportune time to be thinking about that. And wherever you live in the state of Victoria, if you've been anywhere near fires, Little Desert, Grampians, Garryoweed, you would think, and it's reasonable for us to expect, many plans to be greatly modified in light of recent experiences and not just, well, we had this one on the plan for years, we're going to keep doing it because it's already prepped. There is a risk that you get a sort of a momentum that you can't stop, but I think with a well-informed and engaged community, this is a two-way conversation that should be taking place as the landscape changes with every fire season.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll just jump into some of the questions from while we're on this. We got a question from Carrie Giles. Can you explain a bit more about ferals going into burnt areas?
Yeah, there's been some outstanding research done in the Otways by folk from Melbourne University, radio tracking, I think it was feral cats and foxes, and the disturbing pattern of them seeking out the tiny little refuges, little islands within the burnt landscape and feeding on the small mammals that lived in those places. So we need to up our predator controls in those places because the animals are at their most vulnerable with little cover to hide, the native animals, and the ferals are very good at exploiting that weakness. So there's a window of opportunity straight after fires to be really proactive to try and enhance the few lucky individuals that got through the fire.
And I'll try and merge a few questions here together. But we've got a question about the fire in the Gertie starting on private land and then spreading into the public land of the reserve. But there's also a few other questions and something the VMPA tries to raise a lot, that most bushfires and fires are started by people, and we need to manage people's behaviour. We think some of the best ways to do that is to put on more conservation regulators, more fire FFMV workers, as well as Parks Victoria rangers who can be in the park in those times of high fire danger, put those fires out while they're small, and be there talking to the community, letting them know that even a small fire can quickly turn into a bushfire at the right time of year. So, what is my point there? So, what is the best way, in both of yours view, of managing that impact of people lighting fires, be it on purpose or not on purpose? How can we raise that education in the community that it's not that there wasn't enough burns and there's this and that and culture wars kind of stuff. It's like these are the issues that start fires. How do we manage them going forward? Professor Mike?
Shared responsibility at either side of the fence. I don't think it's very helpful saying which side of the fence the fire started on. I can find dopey humans on either side of the fence we all make mistakes, and we all need constant reminders and education. I think the churn in people in our rural communities, the turnover, means it's constant. There's new people coming into the communities who are naive to the risk of fire. Best intentions in the world are just a bit like the people on the rock shelves we've seen with big waves. There's just a constant need for us to be vigilant on this and educating people, as Michael's attempted in his programs in the past, the community stewards. That's an ongoing, you'll never get it complete type job. I think we can challenge all the fires start in the bushland reserves. It's really obvious. I think some facts and figures could help that, but it's more a hearts and minds thing. What interests me more is how you change human behaviour to avoid these things. It has to happen on both sides of the fence.
Absolutely. Michael Whelan?
Yeah, I just add what we used to say back in the fire service: the three main causes of fire were men, women, and children. And I think that's still the case. And you don't tend to have, unless it's the main cause of fire in a bushland setting, it has to be lightning, in my view. So, or an old burn that hasn't, that's reignited because it was burning under the ground. So it's really going to be either men, women, and children in the reserve, or men, women, and children outside of the reserve. And I think education, again, the same thing we've been saying, and Michael already said this, but the community fire guard sort of approach, it's really sharing the information. People need to understand fire. Back in my day in the CFA, I would recall old farmers saying, "Bad day, you don't go down the paddock. You don't want to risk causing a fire because equipment can do that. So just keep out of the paddock and keep an eye out for what's going on." As for the deliberate fire lighting, you're in a whole different ball game there. You know, that's something I guess has to be dealt with along lines of individual alienation and all sorts of things, but that which would probably be beyond our brief here.
I have heard of really positive effects in South Australia where there were known arsonists on bad days who they actually had people go and visit them and stay with them and help them through the bad days.
Fire I was in on Black Saturday was the one that started at Churchill from a deliberately lit fire, and there was documentaries around that poor chap that was involved in that. It was a tragic outcome, and many people lost their lives there. But that's right. We do have to actively manage the known ones. I guess I was thinking there's a lot of
Yep.
I've got a question here from Anonymous. Local forest fire management staff with support of local CFA brigade held the control lines on the hot and windy Boxing Day, likely saving the remainder of the reserve. This agency has just had staff cuts and decision-making further removed from locals. How can we better lobby and advocate to state government to better resource regional fire management? So if either of you are not comfortable answering that, I can. But Professor Mike?
Yeah, I think that raises a really valid point. the resourcing is ridiculously undercooked, and yeah, when it comes down to people being critical of not having a fire truck at their door or whatever, or people not being able to hold the line, the obvious first response is, have we adequately resourced? And I think Greg Mullins has been on the money here nationally, saying, are we really serious about how much things have changed and what this is going to cost us as a community in resourcing these people to do their job properly? And I don't think we have. If I was to look at the budget for, and this is something I know a little bit about, the budget for Victorian National Parks, the total budget equates to about 2 level crossings removals a year for the entire estate. We just aren't in the right ballpark figures for what it actually needs to be to help these people do the job we expect them to do. So I think, and I know VNPA is lobbying hard to say, let's get the resourcing up. And I think that's at both federal and state levels. We need to be getting a greater appreciation of what the genuine costs of climate change are in this very practical level at the coalface.
Michael Whelan?
I'd add something to that. I'm not as scared of attacking the political side either. Bottom line, the environment doesn't matter with government. At federal, state level, you saw what the federal government did with the Environment EPBC Act reforms they were doing. You see at the state level, it's just criminal the way they treat Victorian, the national parks. They don't care. And when you see, and Michael hit this point probably more directly, 2 level crossings, they have, in my view, overspent on the capital side of things. I'm a supporter of intergenerational projects, and we did that here in my time. But you have to keep an eye on the sustainability of doing that so you don't bleed out all of those other areas, such as national parks, such as, whatever the DECA, such as, but they're always the whipping boy for these things, and it is not bloody good enough. I don't think, bottom line, it gets back to these governments get insular. We have local members that actually just go with the government line or the opposition line, whatever it is. We need a local member that stands up and bangs the drum and goes in and kicks the bin over occasionally. That's the sort of thing that'll give us impact at local level, and we don't have it. We don't have it, and we need to demand it. And so I think we have the tools to do it, Jordan, in the sense of the indications that Michael's given us tonight about getting the knowledge. You already got a lot of knowledge. Dick Wetnell's book, for example, which I think did cause the government a bit of indigestion in regards to the sand mine that was under approval, Dandy Premix. So it's really continuing to do that work, and if necessary, you've got to demand. And look, Save Western Port Woodlands has been excellent at this. So just continue to do what you're doing, and insist. We've got it at fisheries on the island. They're getting rid of the fisheries inspectors. It's bloody pathetic, to put it mildly. So it's time to stand up for them and do their job, and they don't do their job, and it's time that we insist that they do their job.
I'll add a little bit, and I'm heavily biased. I would say join the VNPA, sign up to the emails, get active to look after those people who are looking after our parks.
Yeah.
Because I know the Australian Workers Union has got a campaign for their forest fire managers, and the CPSU, who manage the park rangers, are all, and the fisheries officers. These are frontline planetary health workers. That's how we have to look at them. And our park rangers, our forest firefighters, our conservation regulators, we need more of them, not less of them. And we are sadly waiting for more cuts in Parks Victoria for staff. But if we all join together and push back, just like they have in America with the cuts to their rangers over there, the 1,000 that got sacked over there, that got reversed. So if we join together, we can protect those people protecting our parks. So join the VMPA, keep active. I'm very biased though, so.
Well, I guess, what we're seeing is that, and I'm sorry, in the current, I'll stay away from anything federal, but the party system doesn't work for us. And, we need better representation, and we're not getting it. So it's time at that level as well that there's some consideration on how do we get more influence into that area so that they can't. The problem is there's so much debt that what's taking all of the oxygen out of the likes of Parks Vic and the rest of it is the debt repayments, and we're in serious trouble on it. So, as I say before, very intergenerational project, great, but we've got to allow time for the digestion of those and still be able to do our job.
We're getting some awesome questions coming through, and it's really great that people are asking some really in-depth questions, so I hope I'm doing them justice. There's a few questions there about cultural style burning, and the Bunurong Land Council is doing some cultural burns at Wonga, State Arthur Seat State Park and the like. What are your thoughts both on the cultural style cool patch burning, and when is it appropriate, Professor?
I think we're going to need the best of Western and traditional knowledge to manage a very changed circumstance. And I'm coming back to my rocket science thing. I get really nervous when people say it's obvious what we should do. We just return traditional burning. I think that's actually abrogating our responsibility. We've stuffed the landscape sufficiently to now hand it back to traditional owners and say, well, you fix up the mess we've created, I think is irresponsible. I think it's going to need to require collective wisdom in a very changed landscape, vastly fragmented. From my calculations, about 400 times the density of humans in Victoria than at white settlement, white invasion, all wanting to make a living, all wanting to live safely. It's a very different place than when the colonisers arrived. So I'm interested in harnessing the best knowledge we can available together in a really changed landscape. And I think certainly there's scope for trying to burn cooler and learning together what that is going to lead to, how much risk reduction can be achieved with cooler burning, what's the ecological consequences of that cooler burning, and building on what my limited understanding of traditional burning is. It was very place-based, it was highly nuanced, and it was definitely not one size fits all. And that's where I think we should be harnessing everyone with knowledge of the landscape that has something to contribute.
Michael, Whelan?
Yeah, just one point, and I can't add any more in that intrinsic sense, but my view is that they need to be involved in all these land management decisions, and they're required to be, if I read the Distinctive Areas and Landscapes Act correctly. So if we're not doing that and not involving First Nations groups in that thing, then we're not obeying the law, but we're not obeying good common sense either, because it's just crazy that for so long we've ignored that body of knowledge. To the point where now we're in a crazy situation, having destroyed so much. We have so little wilderness. We have so little even regenerated forest. And the same thing, I'd step it further. We need to be acquiring land and revegetating land as well, and doing that in a way that's guided by good ecological principles. And I don't distinguish between those and the First Nations approach to land management. I think we can learn an intrinsic lesson from consultation with those people.
Awesome. We'll flick over to a more ecological questioning. And I'll just got a nice statement here from Margaret Lee, who is out in the woodlands. She said she's seen 4 species of native orchid leaves, acacia seedlings, prickly moses, twining glycine, also fresh wombat scats, a number of birds, including grey fantails, yellow robins, and brown thornbills in the recovering burnt areas. So that's really beautiful to hear and see. So this one's for Mike and comes off the back of what you just said, Michael Whelan. Do you think there's a need for private land to be managed for conservation to generate this public corridor, this corridor of native vegetation and habitat? Like, what role can private land play in creating that corridor?
It can play a great role if you look at land for wildlife and the different approaches. Like John Clarke on the island here dedicate his land to that, and ultimately, I believe it was given back to First Nations people. At least there was plans to do that, and I think that approach by all means could work. However, it's once you make it private land, it's very hard to tell people what to do with it. I like the idea of interceding in the market and buying those lands back and having them in a way that can build the wildlife corridors we're talking about. We set up a program that could do that sort of thing with the Environment Fund that we set up in my time in council. So it's being very strategic. It's knowing what you want. And that's where we get advice from the likes of Professor Clarke and others as to what do we really need here. And let's put in place a program to try and achieve it. We're talking about, trying to preserve the Holden Proving Ground, for example. That's cases in point. I think that approach is how I would see it, is to try and bring them back into public management. Well, not public management, we know doesn't work. How do we bring them back into effective management? So let's talk those sorts of terms, which is why carbon offsets and other biological offsets and things like that may aid us in terms of generating an income off the land. It may be tourism. On Phillip Island, for example, where I live, we've got 2 areas that have been bought back at Summerlands, and also I've forgotten. I'm a bit vague after what I've done over the last few days. I can't remember the name of the other one, but that is incredible. And we should be celebrating it, and it can generate tourism because people pay money to go and participate in conservation projects up in Queensland, for example. I think there is a lot more environmental tourism that could be exploited. So I think that sort of approach is the way to go. I mean, it's regrettable that Parks Vic are just a shadow of what they should be, and we can't rely on them. It's as simple as that. So we need another way.
Can I put in a plug there for private land and trust for nature covenants to bridge the gaps between reserves, between the public land? We're not going to save nature on public land on its own. If we think that's going to be the reserves, it's got to be whole of landscape management, collectively, collaboratively, people valuing their bit of turf and knowing it well and restoring it. If I could just share my own, my father-in-law was one of the people who helped finish clearing parts of Gippsland around Perry Bridge. He was blowing up red gum stumps that had been left on his land. In his lifetime, he changed from blowing up stumps to create good pasture, to planting native vegetation, to fencing off his creek line, to planting willows, to revegetate, then pulling the willows out because that shouldn't have done that in the first place. Then to having indigenous vegetation. That's in one man's lifetime. I'm really hopeful for conservation. Now the property is a showcase for conservation in the district. It didn't always look like that. And that's a credit to him. And I think he's an inspiration to me of what can take place on private land in one person's lifetime who had the blisters and sweat to do the clearing in the first place and to realise gone too far, we need to put some back. So we're a strange species, but we are capable of amazing change if we put our mind to it.
And I'd like to add to that we're heading for a reckoning. In my mind, we're there, but it doesn't seem that everyone thinks the same way. It's surprising. But with climate change, we're in trouble already. We're going to need to do drawdown. We're not stopping emissions, but we need to do that as a priority, stop emissions. And we don't stop it. Approving new gas fields would be a good start. So we need to stop that, but we need to do drawdown. And that's why acquiring land, planting trees, this is absolutely vital to our survival, I believe. Which is where the Environment Fund, for example, comes from, in the sense of being able to provide a facility for doing that. But if the private landholders are happy to do that, and we do have people in Bass Coast that are doing that now. I've had the pleasure of visiting a couple of properties, and what they've done in those haunted hills areas there is just bloody phenomenal. Real power to them. And let's support others that would love to do that. I absolutely support that. But there's also that other approach, of acquiring land and really doing sort of heavy duty planning. The point that comes out of this, though, is what we'll find is as we start getting more severe bushfires, people will say, "Oh, we've got to clear." So there's going to be pressure on the woodlands, so people want to get rid of it because that's the danger. This is the feedback mechanisms that occur. So we're in that risk factor as well, which is
that was a really disturbing outcome from the 2009 Bushfire Royal Commission, was trees being perceived as a terrible danger that blocked people's escape from fires, and so roadside reserves took a hammering as a consequence of that.
The 1030 rule.
Yeah, really, really unfortunate. Simplistic response, and not looking at how much vegetation and landscape changes, the microclimate changes wind across the landscape. Could we actually slow wind down? What sort of green fire breaks could we be planting? Can we be cleverer in how we revegetate landscapes? There's so much we can do, I think, if we're a bit creative about it, rather than yet again hammering the bush as the boogeyman, the danger in the landscape on those bad days. And people are going to be scared more often, unfortunately, with climate change. Those bad days are going to happen more often, and we need to be preparing for that and deciding, as Michael stressed, what's our plan B on those days? Are you going early, or are you leaving it till last minute? There was some
there in the first place.
Yeah, should you be there in the first place? Some really disturbing research done by a colleague of mine at Trobe University, looking at attitudes of people to stay or leave early in the King Lake area after Black Summer, and within 10 years, all the lessons appeared to have been forgotten. Either forgotten, or a new cohort of people had moved in who were not familiar with the bushfire risk. The results were almost identical to before Black Summer, as though it hadn't, a Black Saturday, as though it hadn't happened. So I guess, coming back to my point, it's a constant educational challenge, not something you're going to just knock over and say, well, we all understand fire now, that's great.
See, people are far more likely to make good decisions around evacuation and the like if they are informed, that we don't do it. So therefore, I talked about some horrific examples out of Black Saturday of people evacuating. I mean, I can't imagine, I can actually, but I mean, the fire behaviour that was going on, I saw it up at Cornella around Traralgon South, and big trees that were just snapping off with the tornado effects of the wind. You don't want people, we were in the thick of it, and we rang the CFA and said, we're here, do not for Christ's sake try and rescue us, because it's not safe on the road, and so we knew what we were doing. That was the difference. So you know what you're doing, your chances of survival are far greater. The people across the road didn't survive. So it's as simple as that. And that's why this knowledge, people will make far better decisions if they have that knowledge at the start. And one of those things might be, well, Jesus, why did I put myself here? The second thing is plan A, plan B, because you can't always, plan A is preferably exercised on the forecast, not on the reality. People leave it till there's smoke in the air, and that's when it's really dangerous.
There's a few questions about the Western Port Woodlands campaign and how it's going. Oh, sorry, folks. Got a barking dog here. Dogs, you can't have them, and you love them, and you don't love them. So there's a question about the former Holden Proving Ground and where that campaign is at. So a few groups caught up a few weeks ago. So it's roughly 855 hectares all up in this Western Port Woodlands corridor. And it's the largest patch of remnant vegetation in that corridor, the largest population of Strzelecki gums possibly in the world, over 1,000 of them, and wildlife coming out of your ears. It's an absolute ripper sight. The price has dropped quite a lot, and the vendor is open to cutting the block up and selling the conservation land for conservation, and then the stuff that's developed with the big track can be sold separately. So reminder to folk, we are in a federal election. Maybe go and talk to your local federal candidates or members, and if folks need more information about the Western Port Woodlands and the values of the Holden Proving Ground, feel free to email me. My email contact is on the VMPA website. I'm more than willing to come and talk to any federal politician who wants to hand over money to buy native bushland, particularly the Holden Proving Ground. But it's moving, and it wouldn't be moving if it wasn't for a lot of the folks who are in this this Q&A. So please keep pushing, keep asking for it, keep talking to your local council, state government, federal government, because it is a nationally significant area. So, I'm pretty tired. I don't know how you guys are going. How about maybe we'll wrap up with maybe some thoughts moving forward with fire, and what we as ecologically conscious folks and folks who live next to and around the Gerties, how we can advocate for the woodlands and better fire management in our local ecosystems as well. So maybe I'll start with, who would like to go first? Michael Whelan?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I'd like to, I guess I'll draw the points out of those that I was making, because Michael's more capable than me in making his points. But it's about organisation, which is already happening with the Save the Western Port Woodlands, and what they've achieved is really commendable. However, organisation around fire management, one of the things when I put the community fire guard idea together was that it needed other things to do. And that's precisely what we've got. So it may be looking at smaller structures under the woodlands, under the Save the Woodlands, that take a focus on fire, a focus on informing people. If local groups were to form around that, but they're also the ones that go in to do bushwalks and report on the sort of species that they can see. That is gold, of course, and so I think that local organisation, and then taking the knowledge that you put together and advocating, you need to advocate to the CFA, to Parks Vic, to DECA, to council, all of those. So it's from, say, the Western Port Woodlands, it's navigating to the community and to individuals, to navigating to these other groups, including government. Just to comment on the election, I think a bit late to influence the federal pollies. They're probably they've heads are probably full of everything at the moment, but I think there's 18 months to go to a state election. So I'd really be starting to dust things off and talking to those that one knows you can talk to that will be active in that time. It's time to do that now, to refine the stories, the arguments and the like, so that those people know you're there, know that you can muster a strong community influence as well. So there's that point. And the other point I'd close with is around those interface. Avoid putting people in harm's way. And that needs to be our argument with council through the planning scheme. We need the CFA advocating for that sort of position as well, because, as Michael rightly said, they have a responsibility under the CFA Act to protect life and property. So once they're there, they've got to protect it, and they will then advocate to do so, and rightly so. We need to avoid and not allow that to happen. It's already happened. Is the prospect for buybacks might scare the hell out of a few people with that, and it doesn't come from an informed position, so it doesn't mean anything more than as an idle comment in that, or a consideration in that respect. But let's not let further development in there that is then going to impact back in the woodlands. I guess they're my key points.
Professor Mike?
Yeah, I support the political nous Michael has and his depth of experience in that space. I'll add my ecological 2 bits worth and just want to affirm the incredible knowledge base that exists in the membership that are listening to this webinar, and not to undervalue it, to engage it and to leverage it at all the levels Michael talked about. You know more about these patches than most people on the planet. And you can help them make better decisions by bringing your knowledge forward. And where we don't know things, being part of finding out what we don't know and learning together what works and what doesn't work, and being really frank and encouraging people to be really upfront about that rather than hiding and being defensive. And I think if we can change the culture of them and us into we're all in this together, trying to make sense of a world that's changing in front of us very rapidly, it's going to require all our nous and all our skills to do that together.
Awesome. Thank you both for that. And thank you for everyone who's given us questions. There's questions on tea tree finger fungus, which I wish we got to, one of my favourite critters. There's so many questions.
It's not saleable, Jordan.
I've got it tattooed on my arm here.
I know, mate, but it's ugly. Compare it to a bandicoot, mate.
I know.
I know. I'm going to get heaps for that, but yes.
The fungi people will be after you now.
I know. They're asking for the scalp. Sorry. Apologies to all fungi lovers.
So thank you both for your time today. Thank you, Catherine and Neil from Save Western Port Woodlands, who approached and worked with the VMPA to organise tonight. And thank you, Jacob, who's working on the admin and the questions and everything. And yeah, thank you both, and thanks to everyone for a great night and great questions and conversations. And let's keep having those conversations moving forward. Let's protect the Holden Proving Ground and the Western Port Woodlands. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Good night.